Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. This is an episode that is about a year in the making. It's a bit of a joke, but there is an email thread with, I think, 59 replies on it of us working out the details and schedules of this episode. So it has been one that we've been working at for quite some time, and I'm really excited about it. This is a book that is just really good and really interesting, and I encourage people to check it out, and I think you'll get a sense of why, if you do pick up a copy, and especially through this conversation. So the guests today are Patrick Bresnihan, who's an associate professor in the Department of Geography at Maynooth University, and Patrick Brodie, who is an assistant professor and Ad Astra Fellow in the School of Information and Communication Studies at University College Dublin. As people probably gather from that and everything behind me, we're going to be talking about Ireland today, and we're going to be talking about specifically, this book, From the Bog to the Cloud. The full title is Dependency and Eco-Modernity in Ireland. And yeah, it came out just last year, just a year ago. Well, really not even like 6 months ago, but in 2025 it came out. And it talks about, historical contradictions of Ireland's dependency, kind of, I'll let them get into the explanation of that, and how Ireland came to have so many freaking data centers and what that means on an ecological level, but also what it means for their relationship to all the bad things that we know from Dwayne Monroe in our conversations there that come from data centers, whether that's, we'll get into AI, we'll get into war, militarism, obviously Amazon, Google, Meta, and on, right? So without further ado, I'm going to bring our guests to the stage, the Patricks. It's good to have both of you. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, thanks.
No, thank you for sticking with it with me as we sorted out getting this on. And I think to start, like, let's just open up with kind of a general question on the book, and you kind of summarizing how the book developed and what you're looking at in the book as we move through it, kind of the main high level points, and then we'll dig into the weeds a little bit more.
Sure. Do you want to go, Pat, or?
You can. I'll let you start.
Well, the book, I guess it's about lots of things, so I'll probably say some stuff and I've missed some things, and Pat can come in. But Pat and I met in 2019, I think, and the person who put us in touch, Phil Lawton, it was around our shared interest in data centers. And at that point, like, data centers had, obviously they were in the news and, being written about their emissions, environmental impacts, whatever. And in Ireland, it was becoming more and more of a visible thing. It was becoming something that was being talked about in the media to a certain degree. But nothing was, there wasn't much research. There certainly wasn't much like critical analysis of what was going on. And I guess, so that's how Pat and I met. That was the kind of initial kind of spark. But over 6 years, and lots of talking and going around the country and reading, and I think also our own kind of politicization in that period. It's obviously a lot has happened in that period. The book kind of, it starts with this question of why are there so many data centers in Ireland, which is a fairly simple sounding question. And then the book is our effort to try to understand that through a much more historically kind of deep understanding of Ireland's development within the capitalist world system. So particularly, even though there's an early chapter which is around the early sort of 20th century before independence in the South, most of the book sort of charts from the 26 counties getting independence in 1922 up until the present. the argument being that like you can't understand the sort of the political stakes of what's going on around data centers, this very obviously significant infrastructure, not just for Ireland, but for world capitalism, tech capitalism, the US imperialism. You can't understand that without understanding Ireland's place and function within, particularly since the end of World War II, particularly since our reintegration into this sort of transatlantic US-dominated capitalist world system. So we kind of tell the story through infrastructure in the form of the cloud and information sort of technology, and through the bog, which is another word, I guess, for the land, and trying to tell a kind of a political ecology of Irish post-colonial capitalist development. That's really the book. It's quite ambitious in that sense. It's quite a big scope. Yeah, and we can dive into other kind of elements of that as we go on, but yeah.
Yeah, Pat, did you want to add anything?
I mean, I guess you can just kind of dive in a little bit to then, where that took us, I guess, is because, Patty was referencing the first chapter. We kind of start with this analysis of a radio station in the West, right? Which we both kind of came across in different ways. I think Patty even found it on a tourist visit or something, like you were out West for some reason. And myself, I'm a media scholar, right? So I'd kind of known about this weird history of Giuliano Marconi, like the radio innovator, pioneer, whatever, also Italian fascist, who was given land in the West by, Britain to develop this high-tech radio signaling station, which was designed to be the first regular transatlantic radio transmission station. And this was in an extremely, underdeveloped, quote unquote, part of the West, and by that it was, only 50 before it been cleared by the famine, right? Folks were, it was either death or immigration, from that part of Connemara in large part. And what we became interested in, and I think this was quite important for how we then sort of framed the book, was that how this was remembered at the site of commemoration out in the bogs in Connemara, right, was not as what was effectively an imperial installation, right? This was a technology that was not only licensed, the land was not only licensed by and for, the British state, for this specific, entrepreneur, under the guise of bringing technological development to, a part of the empire, right, as a sort of public relations thing, right? But the way that this was remembered and commemorated at this tourist site in these bogs in the West was as, this wasn't this great site of innovation. Amazing that Ireland was a part of this, right? And that sort of raised to us, these kind of core contradictions, because, one of the big things that's remembered there is that this was a site that utilized locally cut turf, peat from the bog, to power this what was at the time probably one of the more advanced technological apparatuses in the world, at least in the context of communication, and it required a ton of electricity. And so what they did is they turned peat cut from the local bog, cut by local turf cutters who were employed to come in, seasonally, to come in, cut the turf, and then had to get off site, obviously, right? And this to sort of I think clarified some things about the context of the ways in which Ireland, especially the Irish state, remembers itself or attempts to basically revise the or participates in a project of historical revisionism, right, in the context of kind of laundering but the British Empire basically, and an imperial capitalist through this kind of this idea that this of the great innovation that we're seeing in the context of the contemporary tech economy, right? So I think that this is all to say that we had a few of these moments as we were kind of thinking about writing this book, where we it was essentially just following these contradictions, right? Finding these points where we see these like not only illustrative examples, but places where we see the contradictions in action today, right? And then we kind of followed this to again this much what became basically half of the book is essentially history, right? Or historiography, I guess. And so, yeah, that was sort of how the book developed as we were writing it, right? Is that, we started writing a book about data centers, trying to understand this question. And then what it became was, trying to understand, the history of, the imperial organization of Ireland, industrial, ecological, and infrastructural landscapes over the 20th century, right? And then, yeah, what that looks like in the context of data centers.
Can I just throw in one more thing about the genesis of the book, because you have it there behind you. Colonialism, Ireland Colonialism and the Unfinished Revolution by Robbie McVeigh and Bill Ralston, and that book was a really important book for us. I think it came out in 2022 or maybe 2021. I think for a lot of us in Ireland, sort of grappling with similar kinds of questions, that book was just like what everyone needed. And it obviously it tells a history, and the focus of the Unfinished Revolution is about partition and about the North, which is obviously has to be central. But I think our book, how it's in conversation with that book, I'd like to think, is that it's focused mostly on the South and the context of the Unfinished Revolution after independence in the 26 counties. So there was, like in other former colonies, there was an attempt, a very limited and partial attempt to create some kind of sovereign development project in like the 30s, 40s, 50s. And a lot of that, in fact, centered on things like turf and peat and these kind of indigenous industrialization and resources. But from the 50s onwards, that project, which had been very partial, was kind of jettisoned. And that was the beginning of this deepening dependency on the US and our particular role between the US and Europe and entry into Europe. So our book is kind of trying to do something similar in a way to what theirs did, in terms of, thinking about this unfinished revolution, what we can salvage from history, the way in which dominant narratives, revisionist narratives, sort of hide that history or intentionally sort of bury that history. And particularly in a moment like now, or the last 2 years, and we'll get to this, but like a lot of these sort of histories, Republican histories, anti-imperialist histories, and kind of cultural forms are kind of surfacing because of Palestine and because of what's going on in the world. So I think all of that context is important as well for making sense of the book.
Yeah, that was one of the really interesting aspects as I was looking through it was, I noticed your engagement with Ralston and McVeigh, and yeah, I love their book. I think it's, a must read. But I noted this discussion of thinking about, particularly as you said, the South, what's called the Republic of Ireland, that it's useful to think about it not so much as under British imperialism at this point, but under US-led imperialism, right? And I think that's a really important intervention to make, and allows for a lot of really good, analytical work, that also helps other people, as you say, in so-called post-colonial contexts, right, or neo-colonial contexts, we might say, to think about how their economy and how their economy maybe is subordinated in certain ways to U.S. imperialism, and then what are the political impacts of that, right? There's something in the background. I think it's on your end.
It's rain.
Oh, okay.
Surprise, surprise. Yeah, hopefully it'll pass. It's very heavy rain.
It's all good. I just reduced the background noise a little bit, so that should help a little bit. But yeah, so I don't know if there's more that you want to say about that, because I'm curious of what was your journey to that analysis, of, especially as you said, kind of post World War II, of how to think about as you see U.S. imperialism on the ascendancy, and British imperialism, really on the decline or becoming itself kind of subordinated to U.S. interests. How does Ireland fit into that for both of you?
Yeah, go ahead, Pat.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things, and one is that obviously the post-war Reconstruction, occurring across Europe, right? In large part through U.S. martial aid, right? Things like this, and Ireland. This is something that came up in the research for the book quite a bit, especially through. We really leaned also. I'd say there's probably two books that are that were most influential in the research. On the kind of foundation of the book. One is, Rolston and McVeigh's Ireland Colonialism, The Unfinished Revolution. The other is actually a book by Dennis O'Hearn called The Atlantic Economy, which is Ireland, U.S. and Britain, or so is the subtitle. But essentially, what Ireland place, world system essentially, and this, and so what we kind of come out of that book with, and something that's like frequently kind of elided or sort of not considered a lot in the context of Ireland's FDI-led economy, this kind of moment of liberalization in the 1950s, is that a lot of this was under pressure from the U.S. Right? It wasn't just a kind of natural shift or kind of response to U.S.-led world order. Essentially, it was also in part coerced by the conditions of the martial aid grants, not grants, loans that Ireland received, right? In this context, we have, after World War II, I think it was the late 40s, we have the setting up of the Industrial Development Authority in Ireland, which, again, the kind of central industrial body. And now what, happens in the late 1950s is after this period of kind of partial, incomplete sovereign industrialization around again very specifically around peatlands, right? This was this is the example that we bring up in the book, is that the post-war Irish state, even before the war, but in the context of late 1930s, 1940s, the state is developing rural electrification scheme, which is in large part built on the industrialization of turf cutting, and then the construction of turf-fired power plants across the country to basically build an indigenous energy system. This was in the public interest. This the Board na Móna developed housing for workers, things like this, right? There was a kind of welfarist at the very least agenda to this kind of post-war industrialization. But this shifts in the late 1950s, and this is what's always talked about, right? Is the moment of Sean Lemass, T.K. Whitaker, the Whitaker Report in the late 1950s, which essentially, I think O'Hearn calls it like a passive revolution from above or something like this, right? Where we have, essentially a state, a set of state decisions, from, the highest echelons of, the government at the time, specifically the Fianna Fáil government, to essentially develop what came to be called this model of industrialization by invitation, right? And so that was the kind of key crux for us, right? Because this is, obviously a huge moment in the development of Ireland's economy, right? And the development of this philosophy of economic development that remains the core philosophy of economic development in the state. In fact, it's more intense than ever, and we can get into some of those discussions and statistics around data centers and the tech economy and stuff. But what this signified was, not just a kind of relinking to, the strongest currents of the world system, but it also, sort of conditioned this as, the core component, right? This was going to be Ireland's role in the world, was acting as a platform for investment between the United States, who was looking for an investment platform into what was seen as an increasingly protectionist Europe in the late 1950s, right? And sort of out of this, we developed this analysis where, obviously just sort of doing the basic world systems analysis, drawing on O'Hearn and, other dependency theorists, is that, this is the core condition of Ireland's dependency, right? And it remains the core condition of Ireland's dependency. And this was in relation to, kind of not just, sort of coercion from the US, but also this sense of needing to, reduce dependence on Britain that was a part of the industrialization of the energy system in the 40s and 50s, right? That was, peatlands were looked to because Britain was, sort of, there was a minor trade war between Britain and Ireland in that period, right? Which was sort of, again, pushing Ireland into the arms of the US in a way, right? But again, so this moment, I think, became, extremely crucial, obviously, not only in the way that, this typically historicized in Ireland, but also in the context of trying to understand this, not just as a, kind of passive, Ireland just naturally drifted to, this US interest, and, there was an existing transatlantic relationship, but understanding that this was as a result of specific, forms of economic coercion, as well as shifting relations of dependency, right, from Britain to the United States, right? And what that meant was, this, the way that Ireland saw, to take advantage of this was through what they coined, what the Industrial Development Authority decided was a model of industrialization by invitation, right? So yeah, Patty, I don't know if you want to fill in anything there.
Just a couple of things. Yeah, and Patty, you're welcome to fill in, but a couple of things just for folks who might be less familiar. Peat is a fairly specific thing to Ireland in some way. So one, I think it would be helpful for some folks probably if you explain even like what it is and kind of, some of the, just that, and like there's always been ecological considerations with it, but also power, potential and heating potential and things like this. But also just FDI, like a little bit more about what foreign direct investment is and what that means, and how Ireland has used it, I think would be helpful as well, along with whatever else you wanted to add, Patty.
Sure. Yeah. So the turf or the peat thing. So Ireland is, I think it's 20% of the territory of the island is peatlands. So it's a very widespread. There are different types of peatlands. So there's in Ireland there's raised bogs and there's blanket bogs. So raised bogs are they're much deeper and they're kind of like hillocks almost, and that's mostly in the Midlands of the island. And then blanket bogs is mostly along the west coast, so in the kind of Atlantic kind of coastline, and it's thinner. And effectively, I don't know, I'm not a geologist, I'm in a geography department, I should know better the kind of processes, but it's like other fossil or other carbon based forms of energy, in that it's like organic matter that, animals, plants, that dies down. It's in a kind of a semi kind of aqueous environment. So when those things die, they are kind of stored in a certain way, and over periods of time, thousands of years, it gets compressed and compressed. And that's the stuff that once you drain the bog, you can extract that material and you can burn it. And in Ireland, historically, we would have had timber would have been the source of fuel, but those forests were cut down, massively accelerated by colonization in the 16th, 17th century. And so we don't have those forests. And so turf cutting as a form of subsistence fuel or subsistent, heat and energy has been, really prominent for, 500 years. I mean, possibly longer, but 500 years. And for the most part, that was sort of hand cut. It was subsistence. It was kind of commons, in this kind of realm of commons. It certainly wasn't a commodity, and it certainly wasn't done on any industrial scale. And I think, it's worth saying something about how the bogs in Ireland were, for the English coming in to colonize this territory, the bogs were a problem. They were a problem ecologically. They were a problem because they were this difficult terrain. They couldn't move through this, boggy land. I mean, and those terms of like being stuck in the bog and this sort of stuff, that alludes back to this thing of them being difficult terrains to sort of move in and so on. And so I think it was a problem of logistics. Like they couldn't get horses through these bogs, particularly the Bog of Allen, which is the massive one in the middle of Ireland. They couldn't cross the terrain. And obviously, for a colony, you need to, make the land productive. You need to drain it and make it suitable for agriculture. And then you need to be able to extract those resources and bring them back to the metropole or to the core. And so they were always a problem, and there was always these efforts to drain the bogs, to sort of improve the bogs. Irish indigenous, were referred to as bog trotters. There was a sort of way in which there was like, alongside the kind of not quite hatred, but the kind of devaluing of these boggy landscapes, there was also this sort of devaluing and sort of in terms of the racial constructs around Indigenous Irish as being lazy, as being unable to sort of tame these lands and make them productive, all of this stuff. So it runs quite deep. And so I think maybe we'll get to it in a later question, because I'm going off a little bit in terms of like what it meant to industrialize the bogs, what it meant to sort of drain the bogs and turn them into like electricity for a newly formed post-colonial state, just how significant that was. We could maybe talk a little bit about, why that is so impressive. I think. I mean, ecologically, it was terrible, but in terms of an effort to sort of de-link from dependence on British coal as the main source of fuel, it was a huge thing. So that's the Peat. I think I got to that, and then the FDI. That's foreign direct investment. So it's interesting you say that, because I think there's probably a few things that Pat and I refer to in the book, or when we talk about our research, which is outside of Ireland, you need to explain, and we just take it for granted. And FDI is definitely one of those, because FDI is so well understood here, because it is so central to not just the economy, but society. Like there's almost a kind of existential sort of attachment to FDI. And the way it's talked about, and we refer to that in the book, as FDI nationalism. So a little bit like other post-colonial or neo-colonial countries may rely on one resource like oil or hydrocarbons or other things as like the main source of revenue. And there's a whole kind of ideology around that resource. In Ireland, it's FDI. So it's the state's ability to attract and keep foreign direct investment. And what that looks like is over different periods, and the book goes through, different periods of FDI. It looks like different things at different times. At the moment, the key sort of sector is the tech sector, and it takes the form of data centers in these facilities. But obviously, Ireland is also a tax haven, and it has been, it has had a very friendly sort of tax regime since the 60s, when this policy, this strategy sort of began, but particularly since the 80s, with the IFSC, the International Financial Services Centre, was set up in 1986. And that makes Ireland a tax haven where, the profit, like global profits from multinationals, are routed through this very small part of Dublin city centre. And there is a huge set of services, financial, legal, accounting, consultancy around that. And Ireland's sort of everything in Ireland, really, a lot of what happens in Ireland depends on that corporation tax. And those companies are not necessarily doing things here. I mean, some of them do. There's Intel has a big, chip processing. We have big pharmaceuticals, and obviously digital services through cloud computing. But a lot of that corporation tax, it's not because of any kind of activity that happens here. It's just because of the way our tax codes work. So FDI means different things. And I think for us in this book, there's probably been quite a lot of attention given to the sort of the way the IFSC works and the way corporation tax works in Ireland. But I think what we wanted to really emphasize was more the infrastructural and ecological and resource. I use the word footprint, although we don't like the word footprint. I mean, ecology is the better word, because it produces landscapes. It's not just a sort of a draw on water or a draw on energy. It like our infrastructures and our ecologies in Ireland have been shaped by a state that operates for the interests of multinational corporations. And so, you could talk about, I mean, except for that period of the 30s, 40s, 50s, where there were large infrastructure projects like rural electrification, there were housing schemes. But from the 60s onwards, to different degrees, and certainly now it's becoming very acute and obvious, but infrastructures are developed first and foremost for multinational corporations. And the benefits for the people, for the population, are kind of secondary. And that's a really important sort of insight or argument I think we make in the book, is that when it comes to the question of infrastructure and the politics around infrastructure, we have to ask who the infrastructure is, who does it serve, whose interests, because there are massive deficits here in terms of housing, healthcare, transport, basic things, decarbonization. But there is a massive investment in infrastructures for particularly the tech companies, and the state does everything it can to enable that. So the book is trying to show how that comes out of a much longer history before tech was here. Even it goes back to, like, the first wave was in the 60s with mining. We're not a country known for mineral resources, but in the 60s that was the kind of go-to. We had a big zinc mine, and other massive mines, which was just because of the way in which our economy was trying to find anything it could that was of interest to, in this case, it was Canadian mining companies. But that's a very kind of crude form of how FDI operates through landscape. And today you see it in a much more sophisticated way through energy infrastructure. Yeah.
Yeah, this for folks, like, I found this picture as I was like looking for stuff, and this is a Meta data center. You know, I mean, it's just
It's one of
insane
the
looking,
biggest.
like yeah.
Yeah, and just to say, that's one of the facilities there, right? There's two of the exact same size and shape there. You see them as you're flying out of the airport. Again, absolutely going to land right there in Meath, which is just outside of Dublin. And then there's a third facility that's not quite as enormous. I can't remember which came first, right? But they're absolutely, overwhelming in scale, right? And again, there was, just in terms of basic, if we're thinking about the way that the reasons why this is such an infrastructural issue is that that Meta data center there, sustainability reports, and that facility, those three sheds, gigantic sheds full of servers that they have out there in Clonee and Meath, utilize more, like, it's something like nearly twice as much water as their next most water intensive facility, right? And again, like, I mean, we can get into it a little bit, but data centers use 50% of the electricity in Dublin and County Meath, right? And in Meath itself, there's maybe a couple of other, like, I don't even know if there's any. This facility is probably the primary, makes up that primary draw, right, of like the amount of electricity being utilized in Meath itself, right? So you can see just in the sense of, again, it's almost a crude way, these are absolutely gigantic facilities. They utilize enormous amounts of resources, require huge investment infrastructure, right? But at the same time, these are facilities that are built by these companies, and you see the supporting infrastructure, right? And the state itself, and again, we can get into some of the ways that this is really, really intensified recently. The state puts all of the conditions in place, including and up to building infrastructure for these companies, right, to ensure that these companies can continue to operate the way that they do, which then affects the ability and the kind of shape of the delivery of the country's infrastructure systems, right? So in this way, we're very much, and we make the argument pretty strongly in the book that the presence of tech, the presence of specifically data centers in Ireland, is effectively shaping the energy and kind of ecological futures of Ireland, right? And I think what's important about that is we're seeing with the AI push, we're seeing that happen in so many, and a little bit, maybe 5, 6, 7 years ahead of what's happening in other places where, you know, these types of things are being seen at such intensive scale. And then I think also that what's interesting is the fact that not only is the Irish state, you know, not, you know, stepping in to effectively even regulate these facilities in any meaningful way, they're actually doing everything that they can to clear the way tech companies to continue to build, you know, these facilities, and, you know, continue to, you know, eat up, you know, these types of resources. So again, we can get into some of those specifics, but I think that's a very good example. The Meta facility is one of the most significant, I would say, in Ireland.
Yeah. I want to, before we get back there, I do want to go back into some of the work you do in the first couple of chapters of this book. So you did reference already Marconi, right, and this early 20th century transatlantic radio station in the Connemara bogs as, like, you know, kind of one of the case studies that you look at in the book. I don't know if there's more you want to talk about that in chapter 1 around energetic mediation and imperial geographies. But there's also then chapter 2, you go heavily into, you know, the nationalist era and the mid 20th century and some of the state-owned companies and so on. And so, you know, I don't know where you want to go next, but I'd be open to delving a little bit into those chapters if you want to.
Cool. I might say something about the Marconi one because Pat already introduced it. But I think going back to this thing about the revisionist histories of Ireland, which is about trying to cleanse is maybe a strong word, but like distance the contemporary 26 counties from its Republican colonial, anti-colonial sort of pasts, which has been a project that's been underway since the 70s, really, and in part because of a desire to distance us from what was happening in the north at that time, which was also linked to a desire to attract foreign direct investment. The idea that the south was not like the north, there wasn't a place where there was this discontent. It was a safe place to build your factories and to, you know, invest your money, that kind of thing. So this kind of revisionist narrative, which has been underway for such a long time, part of each of the chapters is an attempt to, you know, whether implicitly or explicitly address that. And I think in the case of the Marconi sort of station, it's not just to show how that's commemorated today, but it's also to try to recover or salvage some of the more anti-imperialist sort of currents around that. So in the case of Marconi, it was during the Civil War. So Ireland fought a war of independence against the British from sort of 1919. And that war of independence ended with the treaty that was signed in 1921. As part of that treaty, the North remained part of the United Kingdom, and the South, it was a kind of a partial. We became part of the Commonwealth, essentially, like a dominion status. And there was a civil war between the pro-treaty and anti-treaty sides, and the anti-treaty side was ultimately defeated, but the last place they kind of had a stronghold was in Connemara in the west, in Mayo. And they took the Marconi radio station largely because they recognized rightly that it was a strategic infrastructure. It could be used to communicate with British naval boats, for example, who were working with the Free State pro-treaty forces to crush the anti-treaty side. So they took the radio station and they sabotaged it. And we looked at the kind of media, kind of at the like national media, newspapers at the time, of how they reported on it. And the way they talk about the anti-treaty side, which were termed irregulars, deliberately labeled irregulars, was that they were kind of anti-civilizational. They were anti-progressive. They had destroyed this marvelous technology. You know, that they were kind of barbaric. They maybe even used that sort of terminology. So I think that that's just something I'd like to bring out about that story, is that the technology was always political because it was called Imperial Wireless, and it was a place to develop a technology to massively expand conquest of territory at a time when, Germany, Britain, France, US, Japan, I mean, this was the height of that kind of imperialist competition. This technology was central to that, in the same way that we can think about AI as being central to, new or intensifying imperial competition. And Ireland was a test bed or a laboratory where that technology was being developed. So it was always political, but it only became talked about as political when it was contested, when it was seized, when it was appropriated within the context of an anti-colonial struggle and an anti-imperialist struggle. And I just think that that's an interesting, part of the story, which again is often, left out, that is worth, bringing up, because in each of the chapters we try and talk about like the more sort of, the dominant sort of, this is how things happened. But within each of these phases of Ireland's development, there were struggles, just as today there are struggles. And the way in which the history is told is that those struggles are dismissed or seen as minor. So I'll just add that in.
Yeah, thank you. Pat, did you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to kind of build on that, on Patty's last point there, to go into because where we take that in the second chapter is talking about the industrialization of turf cutting, right? But from obviously a very, very different philosophy, right? It's like, so I think the kind of point of contrasting those is that, we're looking at the philosophy behind the Marconi wireless station, right, was very much embedded in this sense of that native Irish needed to be improved, right, via this technological, industrial, economic intervention, right? It was this very kind of like liberal colonial mindset, right? Where it wasn't just kind of clearance, extermination, right? This was about there is parts of this landscape that can actually be utilized, and then we could, in doing so, it's a moral imperative to then civilize the native Irish, et cetera, right? That was embedded in that philosophy, right? And that's kind of something that we draw out of the Marconi station. And what I think we can think about in terms of what carries over to this period of state industrialization is this sense that peatlands need to be modernized through advanced technological intervention, right? They remain a kind of wasteland, right, that needs to be utilized. But the difference is that the philosophy behind the state was that this is a kind of improvement that does actually develop some kind of distributive politics for the folks who are working the land, right, for the folks who live in these areas, right? So where we kind of draw these things out in that chapter is through it's not just the process of industrialization of turf cutting, right, which was an enormous sort of endeavor, right? It required large scale drainage of enormous proportions of mostly the Midlands. Patty was talking about the blanket bogs, right? These are the most productive turf deposits, right? Because they're quite deep. These are kind of hillocks of peat, made up most of the Midlands at the time, and which are kind of flat, boggy, right? And seen as quite underdeveloped, right? In the this was the 30s and 40s, right? So in the what was it? It was the Turf Development Act, right? What they do is they promise, okay, we are going to industrialize this process of turf cutting in order to break dependence on British coal, right? In order to develop a sovereign, energy system here in Ireland, right? Building on, for example, the establishment of the Electricity Board in 1927, which is the world's first public energy utility. And so this process of the industrialization of peatlands was about this sort of, it was a nationalist, it was a sovereign industrialization project. And what they did was they also then, aided in the development of, sort of modern kind of welfarist ways of life in this part of the country, right? There was quite a lot of inward migration, for example, from the West into the Midlands, because, there was not just jobs, but they were also building housing. There was an architect that we spent quite a lot of time talking about his plans in the book, because they were very modernist, right? But this was a kind of like post-colonial modernism, right? That was the sort of about kind of what was seen as this kind of double-centric model of the metropole versus the peripheries, right? Where you had this kind of Dublin, kind of urban versus rural type of thing, right? And it was kind of about trying to correct that, right, in this process of industrializing turf cutting and developing power plants that were entirely powered by turf in different parts of the country, right? And so, in this, you have, the establishment of basically these Bordnamona company towns. Bordnamona is the turf development body. Bordnamona company towns in the Midlands, as well as the development of power plants in the West in, these blanket bogs that were never intended to be profitable, right? The point was we are going to build energy infrastructure by and for communities in the West, who are, facing histories of, continued forms of energy poverty, and you again kind of bringing this, electrification to parts of the West in ways that could not really be necessarily profitable, right? We tell stories in the book about how the turf cut from Mayo, for example, that was going into the Bellacorrick station, right, was actually seen as like quite crappy turf, right, because it was so wet. It was really hard to make this productive in these ways, right? But how we track that with the Marconi station, right, is that this was not about developing profitable technology. This was not about kind of building these kind of outposts across the empire, right? Marconi was very hand in glove with the British Empire, building stations in Ghana, Hawaii, west of Ireland. This was these were obvious imperial outposts, right? But this was about kind of indigenous economic development, right? Indigenous industrial development in Ireland. And I think that where the kind of contradictions come in here is that at the time you have what is quite a conservative, theocratic Fianna Fáil party, right? In the context of, this is a Catholic nationalist party, but maintains some of these kinds of, you don't want to say socialist, but, some kind of, like, at the very least, a sense of sort of social democratic, welfarist philosophies, ideologies within, their government through the 30s, 40s, 50s, right? Or through various governments through the 30s, 40s, 50s. But this was charged by Fine Gael, the more conservative party, right, to say the least, as like, what is this? This is socialism. This is this idea of industrializing the bogs for sort of public good, public interest was seen as like crazy, right? This was very much folks were kind of demonized, painted as this was a kind of folly, right, to develop in this way. So there's that that kind of conflict, that kind of contestation, within within the state. But then, obviously over time, this philosophy develops into it's Fianna Fáil that also then decides in the 1950s to open up the economy, right, to kind of liberalize in this way. And I think that what's important to point out there is that, especially in the context of kind of post-colonial kind of navigation of dependencies in the world system, right, is that the philosophy of industrialization by imitation, the kind of model of the Industrial Development Authority, the model of, for example, the development of the Shannon Free Trade Zone in the West, which was the world's first free trade zone, established in 1956 or 1957, on a model of basically tax-free export processing led industrialization, is that this is still, at least in the words, and I think actually even in the kind of ideological model of the Fianna Fáil government, this is still for a kind of industrialization, a kind of sovereign industrialization, right? And that's where we kind of pick out that origin of this FDI nationalism, right? Is that it's not only very embedded, but it's also still yet it's still embedded in a sense that this is about the national good, right? That this model of industrialization is actually, how Ireland has managed to, kind of claw itself out, a place in the world, right? And this kind of revisionism around, like, Ireland, sort of being part of, imperial apparatus, wasn't this great that Marconi was here, and this way that, this has also become the kind of nationalist project of industrializing by mobilizing this position in the world, right, between the US and Europe, right, as this kind of plucky post-colonial state, I think is quite important to understand, right? And I think that, there's other things in the second chapter that I think are important in the context of, for example, an environmental argument about this period is that this was extremely unecological. Absolutely, peatlands are extremely efficient carbon stores. This destroyed the Midlands blanket bogs, right? In a way that will not be able to be repaired, in the foreseeable future. But at the same time, this was buy-in for a kind of public good and a public interest. And that kind of philosophy, which has completely been eaten up by this FDI model, is something that we think is something that we should, try and not only understand, but maybe, kind of remember and, maybe draw some lessons from, especially in the context of, industrial development remaining, this kind of extremely important part of, Irish economic philosophy, but then also, this kind of return of strong industrial policy in, across the world in the form of, green industrial policy and AI and stuff. So, yeah, sorry, that's kind of a long explanation of that second chapter, but that's, I think it's, a kind of important turning point in the book, I think, is us kind of tracing that period.
No, thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Will I add a couple of things? I think just as an illustration of what Pat's saying about this weird, like, it's like both contradiction and continuity between that, like, sort of more sovereign development project that was in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and then what comes after with this FDI model, is that today there are, well, one in particular, a CEO of a data center company. So he's Irish, but he's the kind of Irish manager. He's the manager of the Irish operations of a global data center company. He has talked about the need for Ireland to develop an Ardna Crusha for the tech industry. And Ardna Crusha is the hydroelectric dam that was built in 1927. That was like a marvel in the sense that it was like, one of the most advanced hydroelectric dams that had been built at that time, a fledgling post-colonial, state. And the idea that the fact that that argument can be made, and it's also made about offshore wind, that we have this abundant resource of offshore wind. We're almost at a moment where, well, we are in a moment where there is an effort to sort of draw a line between what's happening now with the industrial strategies of the state with what happened in the 30s, the 20s, 30s, 40s, even though they were four very different models of development. They can draw this line of connection. And I think it's for us, and hopefully in the book, is to point out why they are so different. And I think one way we can look at how different they are is this idea of technological dependency. So, like, when we think about the industrialization of the bogs and using it for energy, that's not just about scale, it's about developing expertise. So in the 1930s, when Fianna Fáil began this effort to use turf rather than imported coal, the only type of sort of turf technologies were really hand-cut turf, except for Marconi and a few little entrepreneurial sort of ventures. And so the sort of technological ability to drain at scale, extract, to mechanize that, and then to turn that into electricity. So not just extract more so it could be burnt in households or whatever, but to turn it into electricity that then will be put in a grid. That was in the space of 2 decades, was like unbelievable. And, Pat talked about the thing of the kind of, this like post-colonial modernity or modernism. There's a mural that we open the chapter with, which was painted by Sean Keating, who was one of these, artists who is seen as sort of very central to the aesthetic of the newly independent Ireland. And it was real like social realism and kind of very grand scale and so on. And he painted the mural for the Irish entry to the World Fair in 1939 in New York. And the mural is it's a huge scale, so it's like life size, and it shows Ardnacrusha Dam. It shows an excavator which was used on the bogs. It shows the new national airline, Aer Lingus, and it shows a kind of a modernist building. And then at the front, there are artists, engineers, surveyors, who are there like looking out over this vista. And it was this sense of like Ireland developing for itself, like that sense of a really sovereign development that was drawing on sort of modernist impulses, but in a kind of vernacular way, which we see, in Ghana, we see in, Senegal, we see it across all different contexts. You see this kind of, not just sort of infrastructure, but an aesthetic. And I think what's interesting for us about looking at that is we don't want to idealize it in any ways, because it really was they were very anti-communist. They were, as much as they had sort of some socialist sort of leanings or inclinations, it was not a progressive, it was anti-feminist, it was anti-workerist, it was all sorts of ways. But that same period, for the same reason that we have the kind of revisionist narrative, which is Ireland began to be modern only once we had FDI, once we began to open up and liberalize from the 50s, 60s onwards. And that period, 30s, 40s, 50s, is seen as the Dark Ages. It's associated with De Valera, who was the sort of key figure of the Fianna Fáil figure in the new state, with the church, socially conservative, very inward-looking and very poor. And all of those things are true, but it doesn't explain that Sean Keating mural. It doesn't explain Bordnamona. It doesn't explain why Ireland in 1952 had one of the first international peatland symposiums, where representatives from like 16 countries came, including the Soviet Union. It doesn't explain that there were the threads or the elements of a different type of modernity. And I think, again, because I've said this, I think, in all of my contributions, is that like, without us thinking when we wrote the book, so much of it is about just trying to challenge these narratives that we just get fed and fed and fed, and trying to salvage what we can from these histories, which, at least in the context of Bordnamona and the peatland and the bog, was like a remarkable feat. And it's something that, again, we might come to this, but Pat and I have been quite engaged with communities in the Midlands where that industry has sort of shut down since the late 80s, a bit like coal mining in the UK. And there's supposedly a just transition happening there in these kind of fossil fuel dependent areas. But what's happening there is data centers are being built, large wind farms to power those data centers. And the kind of that history, that very sort of ambitious and sort of proud history that people feel, the workers and the communities that live in the Midlands, is sort of actively buried. And part of that is because of an ecological argument, an environmental argument. So Bordnamona still exists today by name, and its sort of transition strategy is brown to green. And there's this real sense that this was a dirty past. We don't want to return to it. And what we want to turn to is like new renewable energy technologies, data centers. That's the kind of future. So, in all of these different places you can look, there's this common theme of a kind of a very, very powerful kind of ideological revisionism that we try to challenge.
Appreciated. Before we move on, a couple of questions in the chat about your use of like modernity and the modern within the texts. How do you engage with that idea, and what are you thinking, when you present that within the book?
Do you want to go ahead, Pat? I feel like you'd have
Yeah, I'll take that one. Yeah, I mean, that's. I think that because we kind of with again, like, I think eco-modernity, eco-modernism was kind of one of the first things that even when we were kind of pitching the idea of the book around to people, right? This was always kind of at the core, because kind of ending on or starting with what Patty was just describing there in the Midlands, right? This kind of model of brown to green that is completely premised on FDI, right? That is completely premised on the development of data centers, wind farms, right, which are overwhelmingly, if not entirely at this point, privately developed by huge energy multinationals. The kind of models of like carbon crediting and the kind of geoengineering by and for carbon crediting, right? All of the arguments about rewetting the peatlands in the Midlands, for example, are completely at this point, embedded with a sense that these at some point we will need to develop some model of crediting, crediting the carbon in these landscapes for this kind of carbon financialization, net zero accounting, this kind of stuff, right? So this kind of eco-modern dynamic, right, whereby we have Bord na Móna, which was, kind of the central semi-state, it's called a semi-state in Ireland, kind of Quango in the UK lexicon, right? This it's a for-profit state body, right? Today, but it was established as a kind of central kind of state body in charge of the development of the turf industry, right? In the 1930s, 1940s. And so what we see through Bord na Móna is this really obvious transition from a sort of national modernism, right, into this kind of eco-modernist dynamic of sort of tech-led, techno-solutionist, large-scale intervention. And I think that one of the key things for us in terms of that, of modernism, at least how we think about it in this more normative sense, right, in terms of describing what we're seeing, is this issue of scale, right? We have the eco-modernism is completely premised on a like-for-like substitution model, right? It is, we have X amounts of, gigawatts produced by, fossil fuel plants that needs to be replaced by X amounts of gigawatts produced by wind farms, right? And that, model also then needs to account for the fact that energy use will continue to grow as we continue to modernize, as we continue to, kind of embed, let's say, for example, digital technologies in more and more sectors of the economy, right? So in that sense, that kind of modernism is, based on this like normative sense of modernization, right? And again, we could go into some of the stuff. We had a lot of discussions about this in early stages of especially writing the introduction, because one of the key revisionist currents in, we keep saying the term revisionism, but this is a very specific historical disciplinary ideology in Irish history that takes shape, as Patty was saying, that really takes a strong hold over the course of the 70s, 80s, and 90s in Irish historiography, as to kind of distance Irish history from this sort of anti-colonial Republican struggle, right? And key within that is what would be called in the it would be modernization theory, right? The sense that there actually was some good long story short, there was actually some good things that that British colonization did for Ireland, right? Is that kind of modernization theory. You have some famous texts about the kind of economic modernization of Ireland, and how some of the we can trace some of these processes in and through the logics and models of economic and kind of improvement, quote unquote, that were tried out by the British state in Ireland, right? So we very much kind of trace these things through that, and that kind of normative sense of modernization as it develops as a sort of continuous progressive line is something that we wanted to challenge, right? Was in this sense of even at the very least in reckoning with these projects of a kind of national modernism that contained within them something that it might be worth salvaging, right? alongside, this sense of, an eco-modernization that is, even if, you're kind of taking these, normative stances of, progression seriously, are very much about, this kind of a colonial, or don't want to say colonial necessarily, but let's say an imperialist, kind of sense of drain, right? Economic drain from, the periphery to the core, right? And, Ireland's kind of role in that as a semi-periphery, right? It's kind of obviously part of the complexity of the book. So again, we very much use it in this kind of normative sense, but to kind of challenge that, normative dynamic of, the sense of what Irish modernization looked like, and again, as Patty was kind of saying, this is, extremely strong in the language of, the kind of, state revisionists today that, Irish modernity, industrial modernity, never came to Ireland until this FDI model, right? There was a really annoying but very instructive Industrial Development Authority advertisement from the 70s or 80s that, it has folks, working in what is clearly some kind of FDI plant, right? Some kind of factory. And, the slogan is Industrial Development Authority, missing the Industrial Revolution is the best thing that ever happened to Ireland, right? Because this laid the conditions for, the Irish state to modernize by and through FDI, right? And so again, kind of challenging those narratives was a key part of the book, right? Kind of, addressing and contesting this, normative and progressive sense of modernity and modernization. Patty, I don't know if you have anything else to add there.
I'm just going to add a thing, which is that, so the book it's made up of our, things we've read and researched, in terms of texts or whatever, but we also travel around Ireland a lot. And, there's quite a lot in the book about these places that we go to and people we meet, and, we're engaged with different campaigns to different degrees or different extent. And I think that the question of the rural is also important for us. So we talk about Ireland as it's a semi-periphery within the world system, but within Ireland, there are different geographies and there are different, peripheries, like along the border, for example, and on the West Coast, for example, that are part of much longer histories of uneven development within the island. And I think that one of the things, like to go back to Marconi's radio station, I mean, it was built out in the bogs and it was there for, I think, 25 years. So it wasn't just a generator and like a signal station. There was like houses, people lived there, the engineers lived there, and you can visit. So there's the remnants of it. And there was a tennis court, like, so that the head engineer had a tennis court built in this complex. And if you've ever been to the west of Ireland, like, it's really windy and it's really exposed. It's just this, like, it's like being on a lunar landscape. And the thought that you'd need a tennis court. So we kind of joked about who would be playing tennis with. But there's like these anecdotes about locals who would have been the ones cutting the turf with their kind of, well, not quite ancient, but their old, non-modern way of engaging with this landscape to power this very modern installation. But they used to gather outside the perimeter because it was a very securitized site, because it was this technology, the real proprietary technology. But they'd be outside the perimeter and they would watch the sparks of the generator as like sort of fireworks that sit there, this show from this infrastructure. And there is a way, again, that you see that with, say, wind turbines. So wind turbines, large wind turbines, there is something quite sublime in terms of this modern aesthetic and this sort of engineering. And these are modern, eco-modern technologies, but they are placed in rural peripheries where they have real deficits of infrastructure, where, for example, they may still rely on cut turf and solid fuel heating. So they are excluded from those infrastructural arrangements. And so there's something about the kind of anachronisms of modernity in Ireland, in these rural peripheries, that has historically and today given rise to particular kinds of politics, which is about the exclusion from modernity and exclusion from development. That is, again, important for us to understand, because, these sites are, it's not just NIMBYs against wind farms, that there's a layered history of this. and it needs to be understood within that context of uneven development across the island. And one of the places we go to is the wind farm up in Mean Bog, which was like a real formative experience for us. So it was a wind farm, had a contract with AWS, Amazon Web Services, and it was one of the first, or certainly the most celebrated corporate power purchase agreements in Ireland between a data center tech company and a wind farm operator. And after that had been announced, there was a massive peat slide, and the sort of the mountain basically just slides down, and it's just this apocalyptic scene. And the people who had been campaigning the Finn Valley wind farm campaign had been campaigning against the wind farm because they knew this was a very vulnerable, unsuitable landscape to build such huge infrastructure. And then it happened, and it was like, what the hell? Like, you've destroyed this place. You've environmental damage, but this is also our place. And we went up there, and we went around with the guy Donal, who was kind of involved in the campaign, and it's hard to put into words how. So he showed us the site, he showed us the sort of residue of this sort of disaster, but he also showed us plants on the bog. He picked up things, that like he used to take for toothache, like there's natural painkillers and things they were used for dyes. And he talked about how they used to play there as kids. He was probably in his 60s, but like the bog was not just like a wasteland, like has been described, nor was it like a resource. It was the closest you could come is the way in which indigenous relations to place, like a kind of intimate knowledge, ecology, sort of very grounded, very attached. And then he also obviously had experience of the Troubles, and where they lived was right on the border, and the peat slide actually kind of crossed the border, and of what it meant to live in this place that had been so divided, that there had been this, such a traumatic experience. And he described the wind turbines as like an occupation. And so there was all these ways in which, like, in the way he took us around, he talked about it, but his relationship to these infrastructures was like, it was so infused with these much longer histories and political histories, including like leaving, talking about his great grandparents who left in the late 19th century. There was the Bridge of Tears is what it's called, where they used to say goodbye and they'd leave, and you'd never see them again. So all of these things which are like so far removed from debates that might happen around like green transition in more metropolitan urban contexts, so
Yeah, no, thank you for that. So I want to talk. So let's talk about the neoliberal transition, right? Because this is really important in terms of, how do you get from kind of some of the histories that you're talking about to a place where data centers are this big thing, and obviously, the kind of story of neoliberalism with Irish characteristics. A lot of, I went to Ireland in the 90s, and then I also spent a semester in Galway in 2003. And so, I remember the discussion of the Celtic Tiger and all of this kind of stuff, right? And so talk a little bit about the period of like the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and like the transition that you're looking at there in the book.
Do you want to start, Patty, or?
Well, I just spoke, so I feel like you should, but I might just say one thing in case you miss it before you start, which is that this FDI model that we've gone on about, it has its genesis maybe after World War II. One term actually that we forgot to use that we like a lot is that there was a report written called the Stacey May report by US consultants. So they were doing this consultancy on how the Irish economy could develop to basically repay the loans that had come as part of the Marshall Aid. And one of the terms they use is that Ireland could be like a European Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico had gone through this, it had been reliant on sugar, agricultural plantations, but then it became a tax haven for like US industries could locate there and benefit from these. So there was this already at that early stage, there was an idea of how Ireland could function for the US in a similar way. But it wasn't until the 50s, that late 50s with the Whitaker Report, that this started to this pivot really started to shift. But Ireland remained very poor until the 1990s, like you say, the Celtic Tiger. So it's an important thing about this FDI model that it did not work for 20, 30 years. This idea of industrialization by invitation, as happened in many other former colonies or decolonizing countries at that time, they tried to modernize by bringing in industry, but they didn't escape their peripheral or semi-peripheral position in the world system. So Ireland didn't, and there was reports like 1982, the Telesis report famously said this model doesn't work, we need to try something different. It was a state report, backed report. So I'm just going to say that, and then Pat can say, okay, so what happened? And that's one of the chapters, is like the 80s is this pivotal moment where shit started to get real.
Yeah, because that's exactly it. There's kind of these two key elements, right? Where it's but we kind of mentioned that in the 60s, right? You have the first, obviously, like, there's the Shannon Free Zone, which, modeled this kind of, export-led, industrialization model, right? Through tax-free, export processing, manufacturing in, self-enclosed, can't remember, it was like 2 square miles or something like this, right? A little zone down in the southwest of Ireland. And you also have the, sell-off of minerals, right? In the context of, a pretty traditional sense of, come in, mine, industrialize, provide jobs, right? That was the idea at the very least, right? And you already start to see, some really interesting and, important contestations around that, model of industrialization in the 60s and 70s, and specifically from Republican and socialist, specifically socialist Republican groups, who are recognizing that, this is a new formation of imperial intervention in Ireland. And, as much as Britain was still occupying 6 counties of the island, there was also, a need to recognize that, the new imperial hegemon, was kind of coming from the US. And that's what we were seeing in the South, right? So you start to see that, the contradictions developed through the 60s and 70s. But as Patty said, this wasn't a successful model, but you start to see the initial strategies that would become important over the course of the 70s and 80s, right? So one of the examples we talk about in the book is the Asahi chemical plant, which is a Japanese chemical multinational that was invited to establish a plant in a town called Killala, which is in Mayo, which is, again, far west, very seen as quite an underdeveloped part of the country. Developed this huge manufacturing plant in an industrial park just outside of the village. And again, this was a huge moment for this FDI model, right? Especially in the context of developing in these, quite rural parts of the country, where it was, look, if we bring in, this kind of large scale multinational investment, there are jobs provided, there are, economic benefits that kind of spill out into the surrounding community. Again, Killala, would have been quite reliant on, the employment and, the kind of economic economic activity happening in and around this plant, and kind of adjacent industries that form around it. And what we kind of take from that example is that this isn't just, it shouldn't just be seen as a success, as well as, a reason why, this model is extremely precarious, considering, Asahi did pull out and this site has sat empty for the last 30 years at this point, right? It was the 90s, right, Patty, when Asahi pulled out. So site has sat empty for 30 years now. The town hasn't, ever sort of reestablished industry in that way. But what is instructive about that, and we came across the Asahi site more prominently because there's been attempts to develop a data center there for the last 10 years, as these things tend to go. But what is sold about that site is that the infrastructure is available, right? Because what the state did was they developed an industrial park. in the suburbs of this town. And they also provided the water infrastructure, they provided the roads infrastructure, they provided the energy connections that would be necessary for this plant, right? And so what that model is, is that the state, infrastructural provision for this rural, quite, kind of disconnected part of the country comes by and for this model of industrial development, right? Now, Patty can probably talk more about this, but, did some research on, water infrastructure in that region, right? And the water infrastructure for households, for, communities remains extremely poor, right? And but yet, quite nearby, you have, at this time in the 1970s, you have, the rolling out the welcome mat in the form of all of the infrastructure that this huge multinational needs. And then, just to give another example before kind of tying it up in, the neoliberalism with Irish characteristics, you have the 1982 Telesis report, right? Which says basically this isn't working. As much as we've kind of developed, the kind of industrial model around this philosophy, it's not working, and maybe we should reconsider, right? This is in the context of successive, financial crises, the oil shocks, things like this, right? That Ireland was quite vulnerable to as both a poor country, a very dependent country, and quite somewhere that didn't have a whole lot of kind of robust domestic industry to speak of. But it's roughly 5 years after the Telesis report is when the IDA lands its whale, which was 1987. Intel decides to locate their kind of most significant manufacturing facility in Europe in a place called Leixlip outside of Dublin. And this was the turning point, right? Because in 1987, we also have the establishment of the International Financial Services Center. This is frequently thought of as the kind of birth of the Celtic Tiger, as this tax model. But what we kind of say in the book is that at least alongside that, you have to consider that when Intel arrives in 1987, it was a huge, kind of national news story, right? There's a photo that we include in the book, I think, of, the kind of press conference where you have, IDA Ireland welcomes Intel. This was, national news to the degree that IDA had finally landed the company, right? Especially at a time when Intel would have held an effective monopoly over, kind of the computer components that they would have been manufacturing at this site. So how this is, kind of what happens is, again, a kind of Asahi at a much larger scale, right? You have an enormous amount of water infrastructure required for clean room microchip manufacturing. You have immense amounts of energy required by this specific plant, right? Because a lot of this requires quite a lot of automation, right? As much as there's a lot of, the Intel plant still employs a ton of workers. It's also, the automation requirements also required a lot of energy, right? And how this is, kind of narrativized and historicized, a few years later by, I think it was the head of Intel Ireland at the time, says that basically what the state allowed us to do was develop an infrastructure for Intel, right? This was an Intel infrastructure that was built in a town outside of Dublin. And again, this is, it's beyond rolling out the welcome wagon. It's, you can still kind of follow the infrastructure out to Leixlip, right? This is still an enormously infrastructure intensive place. Leixlip is effectively an Intel company town, and there's periodically still discussions about the water usage. For example, they're developing a huge water pipeline from the west, from the Shannon way out west to Dublin. And a few years ago, when this was first proposed, Intel was discussed as very much a reason why there needed to be more water supply coming into Dublin. Right now, the discussion is more around data centers, but just to give a sense of just how infrastructurally and resource intensive this site is. And we kind of talk about the terminology that we use in the context of how the state develops to kind of model facilitate multinational investment is, neoliberalism with Irish characteristics, where you have the role of semi-states and stuff that maybe Patty can talk a little bit more about. But I think what's key in how the state ensures that the infrastructure is there for these companies is what we call a post-colonial ecological regime, which continues to kind of organize the ecological circumstances of Ireland, whether that's, the flows of water, whether that's the flows of electricity, whether that's, land use, land management, all the way from mining to huge multinational manufacturing sites, that the state's, kind of model of ecological management is, developed by and for, the facilitation of these companies. And we think, again, just as a kind of point about, how Ireland's role in the world system functions, right? It very much is, as one of the features of this dependency is to act as a kind of sink, right, for the kind of the ecological cost, what would be defined as ecological costs, right? But again, the argument that we would make is that this is actually about how the state organizes its ecology by and for these companies, right? To the extent that again, we're pretty much locked into how these companies operate these infrastructures, for towards their interests, especially as they're kind of locked into these green transitions. But I don't know if Patty, you want to talk a little bit more about the role of semi-states in that.
Well, I think what I'd say about the semi-states is just there's a piece of the picture in terms of the neoliberalism with Irish characteristics that isn't just about the role of the US. So the book is mostly focused on Ireland's dependency in relationship to the US. But obviously Ireland also became part of the European Union, or the EEC, at around this time. So 1972, Ireland joins the EEC, that becomes the EU. And that is partly about Ireland being a base through which US companies can sell into Europe, and there's this big market. But it also has repercussions for, how Ireland basically benefits from global capitalist shifts in the 1980s. So there's the financialization, but there's also, liberalization in terms of trade agreements and so on. So Ireland is well positioned to sort of take advantage of that as a very open economy, but it also becomes very, dependent on these other sort of powers or other blocks. So in the book, we don't talk much about Europe, but I think we can't ignore that. And I think how it bears or plays on the semi-states, just to continue this story with Bord na Móna and its development. So it was obviously sort of origins in the 1930s, develops after World War II, involved in this sort of sovereign development project, very partial industrialization and so on. In the 1980s, it is heavily indebted. So again, similar dynamics to what you see in other countries. In the 70s, it went through this big expansion, partly because of the oil crisis. So the oil crisis happened, and in response, the Irish state said, okay, Bord na Móna should drain more bogs, extract more peat, and we should become more reliant on it. But in order to do that, the rules had changed, where Bord na Móna, to do that development, wasn't getting low-cost long-term loans from the government. It had to go to external borrowers. So in the 80s, when oil dropped in price and Bord na Móna had all these loans to pay back, debt repayments went up, and it was screwed. It was just financially not viable. And so in the 80s, what you see is, on the one hand, this sort of internal pressures or internal sort of contradictions that force Bord na Móna to move away from turf and the kind of model it had, which was more social development, to becoming more commercial and more kind of efficient within a neoliberal guise. But you also had at a European level, there were, through the Maastricht Treaty in particular, there was the ending of sort of state monopolies in key sectors, like, I say monopolies in inverted commas, like energy. So Bord na Móna could no longer function as it had functioned. It had to become a semi-state commercial company in competition with other companies for tenders that were put up by the state. So Bord na Móna still exists, but the only thing that makes it different to any other energy company is that it has these assets, which is large land banks. So Bord na Móna and Cuilche, which is the forestry, semi-state forestry, between them have something like 11% of land in the south, which is enormous. And so they have these these huge land banks that are the result or product of a post-colonial or after independence effort to develop resources for the people as a republic, but within a neoliberal organization where they now need to generate revenue from these assets. They don't need these to develop them for ecological or social thing. Their only prerogative is to maximize revenue and profit. And so that's when we start to see going forward is kind of initially sort of commercial ventures that never quite worked. So there's like Sitka spruce forest plantations, sort of commercial forestry never really took off. There was initial efforts with the cutaway bog. So this is the sort of post-industrial bogs after it's been drained and cut to turn it into arable land, so to make it agricultural land. They failed. But now what you're seeing within the eco-modern, so fast forward 20 years, eco-modern kind of transition is that these land banks can be used to host data centers and wind farms and battery storage arrays. So these new kinds of infrastructures that are central to the twin transition. So this is the twin transition is AI plus renewable energy. And these two elements are fused together quite literally in these infrastructure arrangements where you have wind energy powering data centers in kind of closed loops. And this is what we kind of point to in the book of like, we've given this history of Ireland being a laboratory. It was a colonial laboratory for the British. Then after in the 50s, 60s, it became almost like a laboratory for US FDI, and there was the Shannon Free Zone and things like this. And now it's a laboratory for big tech, monopoly tech, and these kinds of visions of an enclosed eco-modernist capitalist sort of future. And these parks, they're called eco-energy parks, is for us a kind of I don't know what the word is, it's a kind of a keyhole into that, because it's you know we could say more about it because it's not just infrastructural, but one of the things the government is trying to do at the moment, and it's very close to pushing it through, is change legislation, which dates back to 1927 when the Public National Energy Utility was founded, which sort of stated or established that you couldn't sell energy directly. A large energy generator couldn't sell energy directly to a large energy user. It had to go through the public grid. So it was a way of making it public, of regulating it, making it transparent and fair. And what they're trying to push through now is called the Private Wires Bill, which effectively reverses that and goes back to what the colonial sort of ad hoc energy grid was, where you just had like some random person who generated energy here who was supplying like a local mill or whatever. And it was just a free-for-all. And effectively, that's what they're doing now, in order to enable these little parks, these enclaves, where it won't have to be routed through the grid. And I think for us, why it's significant is this isn't just an extension of this FDI development model through infrastructure. It's a qualitative jump, because what the state is finding with data centers and the tech industry is that it can't provide infrastructure for them. Their energy use is too big. And so what it's saying is, what we will do instead is we will create the conditions for you to build your infrastructure, and you won't have to be bothered by any kind of public requirements, any criticisms that you're drawing away from the grid. And you will start to see something like an apartheid. I mean, it's already happening in terms of infrastructure, where the transition will be for the tech industry, and you will have gas and oil and turf and for everybody else, and it will be expensive, and it will be vulnerable to geopolitical shifts and US wars and all of this sort of thing. So I think that's an important point, is that what we're seeing now is like is something unprecedented, but it builds obviously on the history that we're trying to tell.
Yeah, just to kind of add to that quickly, because I think this is important in that context of where one of the key features of this, again, what we kind of say is neoliberalism with Irish characteristics, is how these different semi-state organizations come to mediate the contradictions of of kind of a multinational investment in Ireland, right? They act as mediators, right? Whether that's in the form of providing the land, whether that's in the form of providing infrastructure, right? Where we would make the argument that EirGrid, which is the national grid operator, similarly acts to mediate these contradictions, right? Up and until this point where those contradictions become insurmountable, right? Even for a state body or a semi-state body that is their entire remit is about ensuring that they can smooth out these contradictions for multinational capital, right? And this is again where some of the dependency theory was useful. We draw on Conor McCabe as well, who it talks about the comprador class in Ireland, right? Who are very much there's very much I think we call it these comprador formations, right? That are kind of spread across these different state bodies, whereby we have these organizational mechanisms for mediating the contradictions. And I think that where we are seeing that qualitative jump is in that sense, or I think that qualitative jump is occurring, but we are seeing the state attempt to still step in these other ways to smooth out those contradictions, right? Because, for example, we literally just shared this morning with each other, I think it was Rory, our colleague Rory Rowan, who sent it to us, RTE, which is the national media, the national broadcaster. There we go. RTE had a special feature this morning, which was one of their correspondents standing outside of one of the hyperscale data centers. You can tell by the look of it, it's either Amazon, Microsoft, or Google in the background. And there's been these kind of periodic reports for a while now that because the grid has been so constrained, there's been a de facto moratorium on grid connections in Dublin since 2021. Entirely an engineering issue, right? This was a Commission for the Regulation of Utilities that said this. We tried to get these moratoriums pushed in our various circles for a while, but what ended up causing it was specifically the risk of rolling blackouts because of these energy constraints. Now, for the last few years, there's been these kind of periodic reports that data centers are still getting permission. They're managing to. There was all these recommendations as to how they could still develop, but they just had to make sure that they didn't go on grid. But they also couldn't develop their own private wires yet because that legislation wasn't in place. So there was all these different reports that like 12 had applied to connect to the national gas grid, right? Which would require an additional connection by Ireland Gas Networks Ireland, to provide a gas hookup, right? In order to supply what we suspected would mean were effectively on-site gas generation. You say this and people go like, oh, they wouldn't be allowed to do that. They wouldn't be allowed to just build an on-site gas power plant. This story on RTE, like literally this morning, or maybe it was last night, is a correspondent talking about this amazing solution that that the data centers have figured out, which is they've developed what is basically an on-site gas power plant that they're not actually connected to the national grid. Look at this, and what they're also saying is that they probably won't even use all of this electricity. They can actually sell that back to the grid and provide electricity for Ireland, right? So again, this kind of qualitative jump, right? Where we're seeing, what, a state, and its infrastructure developed by and for, multinational tech looks like. And then when you see that jump to, again, effectively saying, well, if we can't provide the infrastructure anymore, why don't we just clear everything out of the way to ensure that they can do it themselves? What that looks like, again, it's beyond, backdoor privatization of the energy system. It's full-on privatization, in action, but being sold back to us as a solution to, this, what people were kind of recognizing as a kind of insurmountable contradiction of this FDI nationalism, right? So again, I think that's, that qualitative jump that Patty's talking about there is kind of intensifying by the day, and we can get to all of these different examples of where this is occurring, but I think that's kind of bringing us up very much to the present in terms of how this has developed over the last 20, 30 years.
Yeah, thank you. So let's bring the bog back in, right? You talk about like kind of how bogs become revalued as carbon sinks and, the new resource frontier, how universities and monopoly tech are involved there. And yeah, you also, I think, put this framework of environmental compradorization in there. So yeah, if you could talk a little bit about that section, that'd be great.
I could get started, although I feel like it's the stuff you get more excited about, Pat, the university stuff. So I think one thing about that chapter is that, so the emphasis in the book is about how infrastructure becomes a way to understand this FDI model and this dependency, that it's worked out through particular infrastructures and also through like resource use. But in that chapter, we talk about universities or like research institutes or third level, whatever you want to call it, as another like engine of this FDI model of development. So from the perspective of the state, it's like, what do multinationals need? One of the things they need, particularly with these shifts in the 80s and 90s, is knowledge workers. They need people who can work in, because pharmaceuticals is the other massive sector in Ireland, biotech. But also they need research. So, research, whether it's around AI, whether it's around, drones, whether it's around molecular biology, whatever it is. So there is a way in which this, important responsibility of the state, third level, becomes shaped again for these interests. And I think it's important because we obviously work in the university, and again, it becomes a kind of a common sense that this is what we do and this is how we work. And we tried hard in the chapter with Pat particularly to like make a distinction between this and the neoliberalization of the university. So we all know that universities have become more commercialized, more privatized, more, contracts and partnerships with industry. But what we're trying to say is sort of, it's something different. So maybe again, it's this neoliberalism with Irish characteristics. It's, you can't really understand what's happening without understanding its links to this FDI model, which goes back to the 50s and 60s. And so how does that play out in terms of the bogs and kind of climate solutions and tech solutions, is around carbon storage, carbon accounting. And so obviously this is a big area in terms of climate mitigation. Like, how do you offset emissions? You try to create ways of storing carbon or creating carbon sinks. And peatlands for the last, probably since 2010, 2013, kind of, it's interesting, in a similar period to when data centers took off. So Ireland's sort of, the growth of data centers in Ireland is after the financial crash, 2013 afterwards. And similarly, peatlands became identified as a potential massive carbon sink in around that same period. So before that, it was like the Amazon, it was forests, rainforests. But 2013 onwards, this became the next big like wish or promise. And so Ireland having so much peatlands, even though most of them have been drained, so they are actually emitting carbon. So if they're not wet, they are effectively carbon. They're adding carbon to the atmosphere. So there is this, like, on the one hand, there's like a requirement of the state with these Bordnamona drain bogs to re-wet them. They're required to do that, and that's just to stop the carbon being added. But there is the possibility that like peatland restoration could become a way of actually storing and sort of sinking carbon, and that is linked to value within carbon sort of trading and carbon offsetting. And even though that the markets around that stuff is still really unclear and has been since the 90s when there was ideas around carbon offsetting, there is a lot of energy devoted and resources devoted to making it work on the part of industry, on the part of the state, because it's like a get out of jail free card in a way. You don't have to stop the fossil fuels. So in Ireland, what we've seen is that within universities and research centres where we work and partnering with semi-states like National Parks and Wildlife Service, like Bordnamona, and with other state departments, there are sort of more and more projects since we started working on this, like in the 6 years, like loads of projects, which are about trying to map the peatlands and understand the peatlands in terms of their carbon like ledger. And that's not all bad. Like a lot of it is good. We need to understand that. We need to reduce emissions and so on. But there have been particular projects that are linked with tech companies, and our kind of pitch in that chapter, or our speculation, and unfortunately we have been usually quite right with our speculations, even though they're all quite like negative things, is that the tech companies, because so much of the carbon accounting is about preciseness and it's about standardization, that they are positioning themselves as providing the kind of digital sort of services at a scale. So big data, which requires cloud computing, they can provide the models and services that will kind of solve the puzzle of carbon accounting and carbon offsetting. So they are developing these models and these applications in universities, including in Ireland, and using the peatlands here as their labs, as the test beds. So that's what we kind of talk about in that. So it's like another level as well, like Pat said earlier, of like going back to the 17th, 18th century, you know, English colonial administrators and you know, entrepreneurs, whatever, landowners, were trying to make the bogs productive. That was in an agrarian kind of economy of trying to make them productive in terms of rent and growing agricultural commodities that could be sold, whatever. It continues and continues, and so even after the bogs have been drained and exhausted and extracted, now we're sort of into this, within this kind of eco-modernist sort of transition or phase. There's an effort to render them profitable again, and it is through these kind of carbon accounting. And the key infrastructure there is provided by the cloud services, so data centers again, but also through partnerships with universities and the kind of work that happens there. So that's the idea.
Yeah, and just to kind of, Patty covered most of it there, but just to sort of briefly add that, you know, part of what that chapter ended up being a little bit was like an expression of some frustration with university environments, right? And you know, the fact that, you know, especially in Ireland, there's a very particular kind of funding dependent research culture, right? You know, that you know, it's completely a result of austerity. You know, this is a post-financial crisis thing, so, you know, we get into that a little bit. But there was also something that, you know, sort of, I think we both realized was a little bit deeper than that, and something that we kind of came to in the research for the book was this idea that essentially the kind of main funding body for our, you know, so think like you know, US, you know, might not be a good example, but think, you know, let's think like Canada, right? They have the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, right? Alongside, you know, the, whatever the STEM version of that is, right? Ireland has, you know, had a similar distinction. There was Science Foundation Ireland and the Irish Research Council, right? The last 2 years, those two bodies have merged into what's now called Research Ireland, and which has also, you know, kind of been grandfathered through the initial acts that set up Science Foundation Ireland in the early 2000s, which are literal amendments to the Industrial Development Act, which is what, you know, kind of formed, you know, the contemporary basis of the Industrial Development Authority, right? So, and this is something that, you know, is not a problem in and of itself, right? You know, obviously research is tied to industry, whatever, right? You know, and that's a kind of typical neoliberal story, you know, that the kind of increasing collapse between these two areas. But what we just kind of digging into it, and we realized that there hadn't been much written about the fact that SFI was effectively formed as an organ of the Industrial Development Authority, right? They literally shared office, you know, Research Ireland now shares offices alongside the Industrial Development Authority. These are completely inextricable bodies, right? And this goes back to a model of development that, you know, again, is much more familiar to, you know, other, you know, post-colonial and, you know, decolonizing contexts, where you have these attempts to develop, a kind of research and development expertise, right? Break, this kind of technological dependency by developing, a kind of domestic, research environment for, the development of, technologies, for the development of, scientific, breakthroughs and things like this, right? And in the 1970s, 1980s, this was widely recognized by Irish authorities as well as international authorities as being overwhelmingly tipped towards the FDI R&D sector. Right. Basically, the reasoning for the establishment of Science Foundation Ireland was this recognition that effectively technological expertise in Ireland through this FDI model was completely being concentrated in FDI, right? But instead of, sort of recognizing, okay, well, maybe that means that, we need to robustly invest in, a research environment whereby Ireland can develop, kind of domestic expertise, can develop, which can form, domestic industries, things like this. What the idea is then is that, Science Foundation Ireland is established on a charter of effectively building research for industrial applications alongside the existing economic model, right? Intensifies over the years, right? And to the degree just this, the kind of higher education environment in Ireland is that it's extremely kind of naturalized and normalized to have the presence and these partnerships with FDI companies, not just to support research in the form of cloud computing, but also as kind of equal partners on certain projects to develop let's say in the examples that we use in the chapter, mechanisms for machine learning to build a carbon ledger out of peatlands, right? So that again, we kind of tie into this FDI story in a way that we kind of see universities as an infrastructure that is kind of similarly acting as an organ for this model in a way that is kind of foreclosing alternative kinds of thinking and relationships and even scientific practices that might be working towards more just ecological and economic models, right? But yeah, that's kind of that chapter.
Oh, thank you. Well, I think it's time for us to move into how eco-modernism is a bunch of shit, basically, and Ireland needs to recover its anti-imperialist, anti-colonial legacy, and how you kind of start to weave some of those threads together and think about alternatives to this arrangement of this tech FDI, I mean, it's this is very interesting to hear about in a lot of ways, because in living with an empire, there is like our country gives no, they don't, there's no interest even in green transition here, really. Like even the discussions that you all are talking about, about like carbon offsetting and stuff like that. I mean, the closest thing we get to that is like, the Los Angeles Clippers getting in a scandal over a contract that's made up with, which is basically just a pass through to give Kawhi Leonard more money, and is supposedly to plant trees, right, as a carbon offset, that they never planted any trees. So it's like in our world, these are, I mean, you don't even have to call them schemes to some degree, but I think part of it is the context in Ireland, in the EU, where there is, more thinking around something like green transition and actually taking that somewhat seriously. But the value, I think, is that within your work in the Irish context, you can really see how this doesn't, ultimately this doesn't work for Ireland. It's not really doing positive things for the environment. These offsets, are not, carbon schemes, and carbon offsetting really is not a solution to the problems of climate change. It is useful, as you point out, right, that like peat bogs could be useful carbon sinks, right? This actually does matter in terms of, ecology and everything else. But this kind of bringing in, Amazon to build an AI data center that is used to store information for the IDF and, fuel militarism and all of this stuff. Like, and then them building a wind farm on a peat bog or whatever. I mean, like, it's wild, right? So anyways, I just wanted to say that, but I do want you all to talk a little bit about kind of the conclusions that you all start to draw from all of these things that you're looking at and thinking about, alternative histories within Ireland and alternative, possible futures as well.
Patty, maybe I can just say a little bit about, sort of where we're at now, some of the kind of headline statistics, which I think are helpful. And then, kind of if you want to get into some of the specifics of what that means in terms of what that dependency means for Ireland's role in, sort of especially U.S. imperial interests and interventionism and stuff like this. Because we were kind of suggesting this earlier, that this model is, not just something that has, continued, but, we're actually seeing like a qualitative intensification and acceleration of this model in, buy-in for AI and, the kind of European twin transition, right? Because I think that's an important thing here, that obviously, like, US, like, the Trump regime's, interest in Greenland and, intervention in, or, illegal kidnapping in Venezuela and things like this, right? That is all tacit acknowledgments of the need for critical minerals, right? It's because, Venezuela, obviously, there's huge rare earth deposits, Greenland as well, right? As well as the recognition of the importance of the shipping routes, right? As the ice caps melt in Greenland and things like this, right? All of that is a tacit acknowledgement that, the kind of alignment of, industrial and environmental security in the context of, climate change and things like this, right? That's kind of the shape that it takes in the U.S. But obviously there's other elements to it, but in Europe and in Ireland, I think specifically, we have to think about some of the kind of industrial shifts and intensifications in the context of, kind of geopolitical bloc, competition and stuff like this around this twin transition narrative, right? So the idea of the twin transition, which we talk about in the book a little bit, but have focused on a little bit more since in some work with colleagues and stuff, is this alignment of digitalization and decarbonization, which is embedded in European industrial policy since roughly it's like the 2022 Strategic Foresight Report, which literally in the first sentence it says that since the war in Ukraine, all of these supply chains have become much more complicated, and Europe needs to develop a real industrial strategy that accounts for these shifts in order to do digitalization and decarbonization together, these twin transitions. So that's since about 2022. And Ireland, so again, as much as obviously the presence and location of the big tech companies here is very important to that, but I think that's a crucial fold to kind of add in, especially in the context of what I'm sure Patty will add in here around the militarization, and Ireland's kind of role in this, in these imperialist arrangements, because just to kind of get where we're at today, data centers do use over a fifth of Ireland's electricity, which is, again, an astonishingly high number. There's nowhere else, even in Europe, where that's the case, right? It's there's nowhere else in the world that's like that. And this is as a result of the intensification of this dependency over time, right? And the inability of the state to, essentially form any other economic or infrastructural model that isn't completely dependent on the investment operation, as well as keeping these companies happy. And I think some of the other things that we have sort of been doing research on since the book came out, probably hammer that home a little bit more, which is things like something. I think it's 7%. I have some of the statistics here. 69% of Ireland's corporations investment, right? Which is 65% of that is from, and
You're cutting out there a little bit, Pat. Hang on a
Sorry.
second. Let's see if we can get your signal a little bit more steady before you. So you're saying 69%, and then you kind of cut off after that. So
Okay. Yeah. Can you hear me okay now? Am I a little bit
yeah,
back? Yeah.
yeah.
Cool. So 69% of Ireland's corporation tax is from foreign direct investment, which and 65% is from just 25 companies. And in 2024, that the kind of breakdown is that 40% of Ireland's corporation tax is from just two companies, which is Microsoft and Apple. So two, tech giants, Microsoft specifically, obviously in the context of OpenAI, right? Microsoft and OpenAI are, ChatGPT are basically inextricable. So, and in 2024 as well, 30% of Ireland's tax revenue came from corporation tax, right? So that means that basically these two companies accounted for like 12 to 13% of all of the tax revenue coming through Ireland, right? So again, just the kind of depth of that is important to reiterate in this context of, basically, where we've taken this, and we wrote a report with journalist Polly Doyle from The Ditch about, basically the fact that this dependency on FDI has essentially meant that the Irish state refuses. Successive Irish governments have refused to take action, not only on sanctioning Israel, because of there's enormous links, not for specific unilateral links between Ireland and Israel, but because of Ireland's positioning between U.S. and Israel for entry into the EMEA markets, right? Intel, for example, there's technically Ireland is Israel's second largest trading partner in goods, and we dug into that, and it turns out that is, we have basically the smoking gun saying that is almost entirely because of price transfers between Intel facilities, the Intel manufacturing Israel, and the manufacturing plant in Leixlip, right? So these dependencies are, not only extremely intensive, but also lock Ireland into the, kind of foreign policy interests of the United States as well, right? And yeah, so that's just kind of to get us where we are, and which obviously then accounts for, not just the huge, ongoing ecological implications of this, right? And the inability to actually decarbonize, right? The twin transition in Europe at the minute is, widely recognized as basically, digitalization by and for defense, right? The kind of, even the corporate sustainability arguments are pretty much disappearing from this. And that is in large part driven by the fact that these arguments are also completely disappearing from the sustainability commitments of the big tech companies, right? Who are all basically deleting their net zero commitments, which were never enough as it was, from their corporate sustainability accounts and things like this. Obviously feeling empowered by the current regime and things like this, right? So that's the kind of context where we are now. Obviously with Ireland being so extremely dependent, that is pretty much dictating the terms of not only the infrastructural development, but then obviously what that then means in the context of Ireland's relations, trade relations, economic relations, as well as increasingly its defense relations.
Yeah, my head's starting to hurt because we're 2 hours, and it's like this is the most important part of the whole. So I'm trying to think about the sharpest things to say, but I think, like, we've given a lot of historical detail, but I think now with this book, I would say that probably more than we thought, like, it's getting quite a lot of traction here in Ireland. People are asking us to give talks, and it's an academic book. It's quite expensive. It's like, it's not the most accessible, even though I think, it's kind of got stories in it, and so there's like a narrative, but like, people want to get it because they know that, I think that there's an appetite to try to understand all of these contradictions that are coming hard and fast in different facets, trying to understand the connections between them. And I think that the kind of structural analysis that we try to give in the book is basically about stitching together, why data centers eat up like 25% of our electricity is linked to why our government isn't taking a stronger position on the genocide, which is linked to why they are, set on jettisoning, the last remnants of our neutrality. These are all kind of connected, and the way you connect them is because of our very deep dependency on the US and also our relationship with the EU, which they're obviously, very, very, even though there's sometimes contradictions between them, it's our position between the US and the EU that makes us so sort of useful for the US in that sense. So I might just say something specifically about those, because since the book was written about that around, particularly around Israel, so there has been since 2018, there's been a bill that was put forward by Francis Black, a senator, called the Occupied Territories Bill, that you may have heard about, which is basically to stop the import of goods from the occupied territories. And it has cross-party support, except for the government parties. It has popular support. And the government said in the last election, 2024, that it would pass it when it got into government, and it hasn't passed it. And this is despite like a very strong and clear sort of support for Palestine and Ireland. And it's notable amongst just being around the place. But the government have just dragged their heels. And Paulie's work, and Pat referred to it in that report we wrote, but the work that the Ditch have done is just really show how explicit it is that you have US politicians, including the ambassador here, who have effectively said, if you pass the OTB, there'll be economic consequences. And like, that's kind of reported on in the news to some extent. There was the term economic terrorism, which was like an internal memo within the department. It was like, if we pass this, it would be an act of economic terrorism. So that was in the national newspaper or whatever. And again, it gets this thing of like, somehow the things that we're saying in the book, there may be more details, but people kind of get it. They kind of intuit that there is this like, but what we're getting or talking about is like sovereignty. And that's what dependency is the other side of it, or that's what's linked to it. It's like sovereignty against this imperial force and power. And that's becoming more acute each day with the kind of actions that are happening from US and Israel, where our government, despite, the popular kind of support and pressure for certain types of actions, isn't able to do them. That is a clear denial of some kind of sovereignty. And so I think for us, and the kind of movements we're involved in, and trying to sort of like move between, whether it's environmental campaigns around data centers, whether it's around mining, there's been a very strong kind of anti-mining resistance here, whether it's around solidarity with Palestine and now Iran, Venezuela. I think it's about that analysis being able to stitch together these things and make it a question of a kind of a democratic, you could say a democratic deficit, or you could say sovereignty. But I think that people are starting to get that to some extent. How that's articulated politically is another thing. Maybe we can get into that, because it's not necessarily a progressive articulation. It can be a very reactionary one. And I think that there's been a couple of books or publications, one in particular called Vandalizing Ireland, that came out in the last few months, that was written by, a reactionary character. He's got no particular qualifications, except I think he's a journalist, some bit part journalist, but he's written a book that has been picked up on the right, which makes similar points to us in terms of pointing at the fact that there are forces external to Ireland that are influencing what happens here. But it becomes a very much like an anti-migrant, anti-globalist narrative. And I think that for Pat and I, and with the book, it's really careful how these arguments are expressed, where, in what contexts, and what kind of work they're doing politically. Because I think that one of the final chapters, we open with this little anecdote or little vignette. Each of the chapters is a vignette, and the key thing about that vignette, it was an event in Leitrim, so again in the northwest, rural kind of areas, and there was this event that was organized where there was Indigenous water protectors over from Standing Rock visiting Ireland and touring around, kind of meeting with groups that were opposing extractive projects like mining, fracked gas, and so on. And so it was a very, hopeful, it was about solidarity, connecting our place and your place, and it was great. It was in a community hall, and there was somebody walking around the audience handing out the Irish Lighthouse, which is this publication that is similar to the one in the UK, which is this sort of conspiracy theory, far right, great replacement crap. And he was handing it around, and people were just taking it, maybe not reading it. And then somebody, one of the organizers, noticed and like kicked him out, picked up all the magazines, threw them in the bin. But it was just this thing about the susceptibility of these places where there are grievances, and those grievances might be articulated against other forces. There may be some kind of higher level, I'm not going to say analysis, but like sense of, but that can be articulated in ways that we don't want them articulated. So it is that, like we're in a moment where like everything is, a lot of things are really bad, but there is also a lot of space being opened up where people are frustrated, angry, and want, I mean, you know yourself, Jared, with the podcast, like it's such a brilliant form of political education, and it's good that people come here. There is this appetite and desire to understand better our fucked up, very complex sort of systems, structures. And hopefully in Ireland, this book is kind of trying to contribute to that. Yeah.
No, it's really important. And I mean, in the US, the right has a much bigger, one, their platforms are much larger, which is partly because of the compatibility with, capitalism and imperialism on the whole. But also the the right in the United States is much more effective at channeling the rage against, for instance, the genocide in Palestine than the sort of middle, right? The liberal, which is most of the sort of media. And so it's a weird situation where people actually, I think, gravitate to the right because it seems more viable to them in certain ways, also because they're articulating it on bigger platforms. It's simpler in certain ways to sort of put it in this language of hate and nationalism and chauvinism than it is to spend, like 2 hours like we've done kind of breaking down the the economic dependency and how all of these things actually function as systems and so on. And I think that it is a real problem. So I appreciate you all, and I know those strains within Irish politics. I mean, we see them to some extent even in international news sometimes. So I appreciate you all, like, intervening in that way. But maybe what we could do is talk a little bit. I know we'll have a separate conversation where we're going to talk a little bit more around the militarization of FDI and, some more directly connected to some of the wars and some of the anti-imperialist work that you and others are looking at there. But maybe just within the book and some of your larger work around kind of eco-socialist anti-imperialism, like how are you looking to articulate some of these ideas in a progressive sense to give people kind of an alternative to what you see as a reality right now?
Yeah, this is kind of where we spend a lot of our time at the minute, and I think it's been one of the most productive things that's come out of, kind of like really kind of touring around with the book, right? We've gone around and we've done quite a lot of talks around Ireland for the most part, really. And it's actually been primarily in, sort of like community spaces. It's been, kind of in different parts of Ireland with very different entry points into the arguments of the book, right? Whether that's Derry or Dundalk, which is where I live, or Cork or Dublin, or we'll do one in Galway at some point, hopefully Belfast, right? So we've kind of gone around, and each discussion has taken on a quite a different kind of tenor, right? Because of the different kinds of entry points that people have. I think that one of the things, and we kind of end the book with this, is trying to move beyond, this kind of, and not move beyond, right? Because you don't want to be the person who's writing a book and saying, this is what we do. I have a program, right? I figured it out, but sort of saying that, like, that there is obviously this appetite for a more systematic thinking in order to try and understand, and better kind of point towards points where we can intervene, or at the very least kind of build alternative visions, right, of what we want, right? Where our sort of basic vision is this kind of like anti-imperialist eco-socialism, right? In these kind of very broad sense. But I think that one of the key things, and where we end, and this took pretty much writing the book, was this idea that, we have to go beyond these, what has specifically been orientated towards these like anti-development struggles in Ireland, right? Because development has been, economic development, industrial development has been so entirely dictated by and for foreign direct investment. Obviously, we see, the extractivist, kind of dynamics of that, whether that's wind farms, fracking, mining, organize all of these different extractive networks in Ireland into this one specific infrastructure. So obviously these campaigns have been extremely important and obviously are arising at these points of the most, kind of extreme contradictions, right? Where people are feeling it, in their everyday lives and, kind of articulating their politics out of that, right? But where we sort of, I think it's the third or maybe we actually talk about this in the last chapter, but when we were, kind of going through some of these, movements against, for example, mining in the 1960s and 1970s, one of our key, kind of something that we found was this group. It was called the Resource Study Group or the Resource Protection Campaign. It was both, right? The Resource Study Group, which was connected to the Resource Protection Campaign, which was, Sinn Féin, the Workers' Party, specifically, specifically Republican socialist groups, different Communist Party of Ireland, maybe as well. But anyways, different Republican and socialist groups were coming together around contesting, the mining projects that they were explicitly framing as neo-colonial, interventionist, they weren't using the term extractivism, but they were saying that this is about the Irish state, the Free State government selling off Ireland's resources to multinational interests. This is, neo-colonialism in action. We need to build a campaign that specifically their solution was nationalize resources, right? Was, kind of build, national infrastructures for, ensuring that, the value from, these resources stayed in Ireland, right? And again, similar to our argument about Brodie in the 1940s and 50s, right? We don't want to like idealize that, right? Or say that like, that's the solution is, we nationalize Amazon, right? Because obviously that's not also the subject, the kind of conditions that we are working in, right? It's very different, something like, digital infrastructure, is, in large part used to produce slop, right? That it isn't, socially necessary by pretty much any metric. But at the same time, that sense of what an alternative model of development would look like, as opposed to, whatever that looks like. And again, I don't think we really come to that in the book, but I think is important, at least for us is, when presenting this systemic analysis is saying that when, we are contesting these different projects is we have to understand them together as, obviously these instantiations of, in large part US, imperialist, interests, right? Especially more recently, that argument becomes easier with the fact that the tech companies are basically just arms of U.S. foreign policy, right? Whether or not they're, holding, IDF targeting data somewhere in the suburbs of Dublin, right? Or whatever else to support the war machine, but recognizing that these struggles are connected, but that there is an alternative that we can and should build for, and that there's something to this idea and to this kind of popular sentiment around development that exists in Ireland that isn't necessarily regressive, that isn't necessarily neoliberal, right? That is something that I think can and should be directed more towards these progressive ends, or else we risk this kind of grievance-based politics that is so much more the remit of far right, kind of a far right kind of populism, right? That we've seen elsewhere, obviously, take off like, wildfire in a lot of these contexts, right? So yeah, that's kind of our, basically where we kind of end the book. And then obviously, we've been working on different things since then. Yeah, Patty, I don't know if you have what you have to add there.
I would say just in terms of like the contribution, I think that it can't be stressed enough how ideologically embedded the FDI nationalism thing is. So I think that one of the reasons the book has gotten some traction is like we're talking critically about this model, and we have some historical account of it and the kinds of contradiction it's given rise to. I think that that's partly it. So like in the Dáil, for example, opposition politicians say data centers are using 30% or 25% of energy, and the Taoiseach will say, it's mad that it's serious, but he'll say, I remember when I was growing up in Ireland, and it's this real kind of like, everyone was leaving the country, the place was poor, and he has this line, the companies put bread on the table. That's the line. And I've heard other ministers in the government say it. So they're obviously being told, you just say this line about. So I think that it's important just at that level of like questioning that and putting holes in it. And I think one of the ways to do that, so we're told about the benefits of this FDI model, and there is no doubt that Ireland is a very wealthy country in many ways, but there are also costs of that model. And I think we can point to those costs. And so, for example, at the moment, I think it was before Christmas, 320,000 people were in arrears for their energy bills. And that's like an increase from the previous year. And Ireland is one of the most dependent countries on fossil fuels. So now what's happening in West Asia and with the cost of oil, people are screwed. And that's partly, I mean, it's not to do with tech necessarily, but like the government are building a liquefied natural gas terminal, for example, down in the southwest, which is an infrastructure that will lock us into more dependency on fossil fuels, US fossil fuels. So I think that there are ways of, as well as the costs of like not having electricity because the grid can't deal with the data centers, whatever, but it's to make that point about, okay, we're always told about these benefits in terms of like figures of GDP, whatever, but there are these costs and the benefits are not equally distributed. So I think that's one thing. I think the other is that the state is doing a lot, as we've been talking about, to facilitate these companies. So whether that is like resources invested in infrastructure, or whether that is the energy that goes into like all the civil servants in the department who are doing research and coming up with policies and doing all that stuff that the state does, it's to figure out their problems. And it's like, there's loads of things that you could be better solving. Like you could be figuring out how to retrofit loads of houses, and that would provide jobs. And so to be quite sort of technical and policy focused about it and be like, we don't have to be asking for the revolution. There are things that are related to like the direct material conditions that people are in that the state can address more directly rather than that. So that's the other thing. And then I think the third thing is at a different scale. I think that there are interesting examples, or maybe not examples, but like initiatives in Ireland which are around sort of taking back more control of the economy. So again, like more localized things, but they are kind of like democratizing elements of the economy, so elements of infrastructure. So whether that's to do with like food production, whether it's to do with retrofitting, whether it's to do with I don't know, energy, whatever. And Ireland has always had those like little elements, but I think that there are more concerted efforts now to think about that in terms of like community wealth building or like public commons production. And it's this idea of like institution building that I'd be most interested in. And this isn't necessarily in the book, but like, how do we build organizational and institutional and infrastructural like capacities to make our lives better and the lives of the communities that we live in and with better? And so that is kind of linked, because sometimes when we give this talk, you'd have somebody at the back who's like in their 60s and they'll be like, oh, we should go back to having our own like shoe factories. And it's like, I kind of would like that, but like, it's probably not that feasible. But like, linked to it is the fact that people are doing stuff to take back more control over like material economic things. So I think that there are different like, points of engagement with it. But I think, and obviously also linking it to the thing that is galvanizing or energizing a lot of people, especially younger people, is Palestine and like foreign policy, like Ireland's relationship to the world and to these horrible wars. And I think if we can make the connection between that and our model of development and these economic questions, that's also obviously very important. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, did you want to say something, Pat?
Yeah, I was just going to add something quick there, because I think that also, another thing that we've sort of been organizing around, we've been doing this for years, but, at the minute, there's a few campaigns that we're working with that are like very focused on very specific like data center developments, right? As we're at a moment of, the kind of very, kind of intensified expansion, where the state is, basically putting, there's like 3 or 4 overlapping, legislative changes that are going to come into effect that will, basically rip off the limiters for data center development into the foreseeable future. Starting to see the fallout from that with, these different campaigns emerging. And I think, again, this issue of kind of connecting these areas that are galvanizing people, right? Where it's, obviously, we have, and I know this has come up in the US a lot, so you might know more about this, Jared, but like this connection between that the Trump administration, I think Trump himself has come out and said something about basically protecting consumers against AI energy costs or something like this, right? Because it's a cost of living issue. And so this is something that's getting a lot of traction here, is that, the data centers raise energy bills, for example, especially in the context of the exploding energy prices with the war on Iran and stuff like this, right? So the in that sort of bringing these things together, right? Where you have groups that are very much recognizing these contradictions in situ, but then also sort of trying to bring in, these systemic elements, and at the same time, also recognize that there is widespread frustration, right? In whether that's Gen Z, Gen Alpha, and, even obviously, sort of older generations and stuff like this around this, that I think for younger people is taking the shape of this like anti-AI sentiment, right? Where it's, you do have a lot of people who, there's this very real knee-jerk, like, fuck this technology, this technology stinks, it's just producing slop. It's, people, it's increasingly clear that, this is, just a enormously wasteful, even in, a kind of very basic, normative sense of it. But so trying to make these things clear, right? Where it's, you have, a data center that is basically producing no good social function, right? Basically by any metric, right? And sort of that, obviously with this kind of naturalization of the FDI model here, that is sometimes hard to get people to, right? Where they say, well, don't we use data centers? And it's, you kind of have to point to, kind of puncture all of those really basic common sense narratives about why these technologies are essential, right? Why these models of development are, the only way forward, right? And again, I think we're at a moment of such heightened contradiction and such enormous, kind of widespread frustration that, there is, an opportunity. And I think in Ireland, we're seeing some, maybe productive and, maybe, hopeful versions of this. But at the same time, this is because there is a overwhelming, we say the word relentless all the time, like sort of step change that is happening with the speed and acceleration of, how the state is, kind of stepping in to, pave the way for, increasing integration and, cooperation with, especially US capital and, EU militarization and stuff. So at this point in time, I think there's, data centers, really do offer a place where these contradictions are really, really obvious, but it's a matter of kind of pushing beyond, this is just data centers, and into, data centers represent, an instantiation of why we can't, why these alternatives are impossible to build unless we, address the contradictions that these represent, right? Yeah, if that's maybe a little bit more abstract than Patty's very nice point about, building alternative infrastructures where we are. But yeah, I do think it's a moment of, kind of opportunity to work at these different scales, maybe.
No, I don't think it's abstract. No, I don't. I mean, this is also something that I'm seeing more in various parts of the U.S. context too, of the data centers, because of everything that, but I agree. I mean, it's like, we know the impacts that they have on, the water system, on the electric system, on the environment. But also on top of that, we also can add what they're being used for, what they actually produce, and I mean, we've had a lot of conversations with Dwayne Monroe, who also I want to shout out because he gave us a contribution today, but also said he's going to be buying and reviewing a copy of the book and recommending to others. But you know, he works as a technologist, right? And you know, he's like, this stuff is just, it's just, you know, garbage, but it's also totally, you know, I mean, environmentally, it's absolutely not sustainable. Um, but also it doesn't it's being led so much by a huge bubble, and it's being marketed, it's being branded, right? And it's sort of one of those things where, and it taps deeply into a kind of sci-fi imagination that we all were given in the 70s and 80s of 2001 Space Odyssey and HAL and all this stuff, of just this idea like there is no such thing as artificial intelligence, right? And so there is these language learning models and these large server farms that can do a lot of computing, right? But this idea that there's going to be some kind of leap, which is what the tech industry is branding and marketing, right, is itself, science fiction. Essentially, it's not something, computers cannot reason, right? And so I think that's an important, I think as people, that young impulse of just like this is slop is one side of it. And we see it right now with the war, like it's becoming very difficult to, part of one of the effects of this is that it's making it harder and harder to discern reality, right? And so this is actually a tool for disinformation, misinformation, and confusing people around the world, because even in trying to closely track the war on Iran, it becomes difficult to know, am I looking at something that actually is happening in reality right now, or did somebody make up a picture of something, being blown up, and all of this kind of stuff. And so yeah, there's a lot there, I think, that's quite fruitful in terms of various ways that people, interact with the physical data center, but also the reason why there is such this emphasis on continuing to build more and more of these things, and I think we can connect it to anti-imperialism and the eco-socialism and the alternative things. So yeah, I appreciate all of it, and I know this is just for folks who are listening in. We had talked before this, Patrick and Pat and I, about doing this as a two-part thing. So we've gone through the book. I encourage people to really check it out, and um, you know, I know you said it's expensive. It's in the range of academic books. It's not on the super expensive range, but it is also not on the like really super personally affordable range either. So but check it out, look it up, and see. And I really enjoyed, I mean, like you said, the inclusion of the kind of the stories right within it, as well as the analysis. It's really good work. And it aligns, I think, with a lot of other folks that we have really value having conversations with, Max Isle, in particular. um and so, yeah, I encourage people to check that out and know that there will be a part two of this where we talk a little bit more about, the militarization of FDI. Also, and this is something we didn't really talk about, but we will next time, is that there have been, you mentioned it, the kind of declining, or the last remnants of Ireland's neutrality. And people might not know a lot about that if they don't closely know the history of Ireland, but Ireland has held a neutrality, right? And this has been very really starting with the Russia-Ukraine war. This became something where people were arguing that Ireland is kind of freeloading off of NATO, basically, in certain ways, right? And so then this push to have Ireland, become more, basically lose its neutrality and become more heavily invested. There's also work that has shown, the way U.S. planes fly through Shannon Airport and all of these other things, which I'm sure we'll talk about next time as well. But this is also, I think your book is really interesting in this too, because then we have to talk about, you know, what are the assets also within Ireland that are already a part of the military infrastructure and so on, that also, you know, Microsoft, Amazon, et cetera, might be interested in having defended by military apparatus as well at some point, right? And so it's a very interesting, you know, I think area, and obviously it has direct implications on the politics that you all are, you know, dealing with in Ireland as well. So yeah. But I just want to thank you both. And if there's anything either of you want to say in closing, you know, I welcome it. But this was a great conversation.
Thanks, Jared. Yeah, I mean, I just say I listen to the podcast a lot, and I've learned a lot. And you know, it's also in the book, I would say. You know, your podcast, other podcasts, in terms of our own analysis, are that kind of education. So really grateful for all the work you do. And thanks for having us on.
Yeah, thank you. It's been really great, and we really have been looking forward to it. And yeah, just happy to, yeah, hopefully continue to, yeah, contribute to these discussions around, you know, especially around, you know, kind of tech's role in, you know, in the kind of U.S., you know, imperial projection and things like this, right? Which I think is deepening, you know, and I think that's, yeah, kind of spaces like this are, yeah, great to, yeah, kind of maybe offer some analysis of that, and yeah, maybe some, you know, how we where these things are being contested already, right? I think is yeah, really, yeah, it's just great. Just appreciate being on. Thanks.
No, thank you both. And apologies that it took you know, a year or whatever to sort it sort it out. But yeah, no, I'm glad that we finally did. So appreciate you both.
Thanks.